Good morning, dear friends. Welcome. Chodesh Tov. It's the beginning of Adar Beis, the second Adar, which means that we are on the march to Purim. It is it the 11th? So it's March. We're on the march to Purim. It's also March 11th, and we're here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. And presently we are studying Maseches Pesachim, Perek Shvi'i, the 7th chapter, 75a. Our concentration here and our objective is to understand the appropriate halachically prescribed manner of cooking the Korban Pesach. And as we know, the Torah is highly specific about what is and what isn't to be used for cooking of the Korban Pesach. And the language of tzli Aish, roasted by fire, the Mishnah notes it must be fully exposed to fire. And on Friday we noted that had it only said tzli Aish once, maybe I wouldn't be so absolutely clear that we're not talking about just heat that was produced by fire, but a direct contact to fire. And our Gemara is going to continue to probe, explore, and develop our understanding of how this Korban Pesach must be prepared. So we have another Braisa talking about coals, gecholim. How do we understand coal? Is coal fire or not? Well, let's ask the panel here. You have to expose your Korban Pesach needs to be cooked over fire. Is a coal fire? And maybe we should ask, when would you suppose a coal is fire? Any thoughts before we see what the Gemara has to say?
When it's burning.
I would assume once it produces that sleep, once it cooks it, then it would be considered fire. If it's not strong enough, if it's not hot enough, actually do the sleep, then it wouldn't be considered fire.
But I guess here's the question. Is it about the degree of heat? Because you could probably have a range or something that's heated up to a very high temperature that produces heat that's greater than some fires. And so the Torah does, again, the Gemara, we'll see the Gemara, but it doesn't appear that the primary interest or the primary value here is heat, but tzli Aish. And I suppose that's why there's a question, and that's what we'll see over here. And there's another big red flag, but Rabbi Steinzel deals with it. So, okay, Tana Rabbanan, a Braisa, our sages taught, Chat Ta'chai, you cut up the Korban Pesach. Does that ring any red flags? That word, cut up the Korban Pesach?
You're not supposed to break any bones.
You're not supposed to be breaking up the Korban Pesach. So Rashi right away and the Steinsaltz reflects this immediate note. Chatzchai lePesach, v'lo hivdil. We don't mean that he broke up the Korban Pesach. And lechatzchai b'shnayim v'shalosh mekayimos. What do we call it? Not scoring. Is it scoring? What do you do when you make a scoring?
Scoring, yeah.
Isn't scoring heat?
Yes, score.
So scoring is heat. We're talking about slicing. But
Scoring could be slicing or heat.
scoring, okay, so then we're talking about he scored it b'shnayim v'shleisha mekayimos l'maher tzliyasai, so that the heat it'll cook more fastly and more completely. By cutting slits in the meat, the heat can cook into that space as well. I'm not sure if we would translate that absent Rashi, but that's necessarily what it means. Are you allowed to cut? I'm going to ask the question, and we're going to move on. Would you be allowed to cut off a steak from a Korban Pesach without breaking any bones and cook it apart from the rest of the Korban Pesach? Is it the skeleton that can't be broken? Or can you even not remove a chunk of meat? Clearly, Rashi would say you're not allowed to move anything.
While
I'm
you're
sorry?
eating the Korban Pesach, you're not supposed to break any bones. Right?
Oh, right. I mean, when you're eating it, obviously you need to remove the meat to eat it. You can't
Still not supposed
we
to.
don't have a chabur of 10 people biting onto the actual Korban Pesach. That would be a very, very
You cut the meat, but you still can't break the bones.
right, correct. So you can never break the bones. But the question is, in the preparation of the Korban Pesach, can you cut off a slice of meat and roast it? Maybe you like your meat well done, and honestly, if it's cooked as a whole Korban Pesach, it's
to be well done anyway.
Yeah. So, but Rashi's language is clear. Cooking, the meat has to be whole. And the only scenario where chatchai could work is if you just made scoring or slices. Tosfos, well, not here, but we'll see. Tosfos perhaps understands.
You gotta take the nasi's gotta be taken out before you cook it, because it's part of the.
I'm sorry?
Certain parts need to be taken out before you cook it.
Right. Yeah,
Like
we
your
discussed.
nasi
Yeah,
and some of the organs.
those are the parts that might be reintroduced if they're clean. All right, let's see. So you cut a slice. That's not our punchline from the perspective of the Gemara. Rashi flags it for us, and it's an interesting thought. Okay. You cut up the carbon pesach to cook faster, and then you placed it on coals. Rebbe Omer. So Rebbe commented, Omerani, my opinion is, I say, Shezeh Sli Aish. Having flesh cook on coal is considered as if it's on Aish. Okay, pardon the nominal pun. If my brother Shalom is here, he would have packaged it much better. Oh, Shalom. Rami Lay, yeah. I took half of it and I left it there, but okay, thank you. Thank you. Rami Lay Rav Achdeve Bar Ami Rav Chizda. So now we have a question. Mi Omer Rebbe Gecholam Eishninu. Is it possible? Does it sound like something consistent with Rebbe's worldview? Does he view coal to be synonymous with fire? So we have a brisa quoting Rebbe in Rebbe's own voice. He says coal is sli eish, but we have reason to suspect that that's not always Rebbe's opinion. We have a contradiction, and then we're going to see if Rebbe could say this. As we know, and again, so now we're moving on to this next point, but it's all to understand the definition of a fire and a fire burn or fire. Saras, leprosy, as we described it, which the kohen is used to identify, and then the person would be potentially isolated, quarantined, and go through a purification process. So there are different types of saras. There is a naturally forming saras. But one of the types of saras is a result of a burn that develops in a certain manner. And it starts with michvas eish. The Torah describes, or the flesh that shall have on its skin a burn from fire, michvas eish. I would only understand that this kind of saras could develop through a fire burn directly by fire. What if the burn happened on a coal? Or beremetz? How do we translate remetz? Smoldering ashes. Besidreiteach, with burning lime. Begivsis reiteach, or one of the translators said gypsum. I don't know what that is. Burning plaster. We'll use Rabbi Steinsaltz's translation. Burning lime, burning plaster. And any type of burn that comes from fire, that all is included in Aish. How do we know that even something that's heated up by fire? Therefore, the Torah uses the word mikvah multiple times to tell me that we include even something that is heated up by fire. So all the first items are fiery coal, fiery ash, fiery plaster. And then we include even something that is cooked by or heated up by fire. Let's look in Rashi. Beremetz, eferoteach, that's burning ash. Gufsis, min sidu, it's a type of plaster. Menayin shnida mishum mikvah lebishum shchin. Achol bishum mikvah v'shchin shavim tomas and afkamino de chatzi gris makas mikvah machmas or v'chatzi gris makas shin. Okay, long story short, Rashi points out that there is halachic ramifications to determining the origin of the burn and what the burn is considered because of shiurim and combinations. But anyways, we're trying to understand the definition of burn.
Rabbi,
Yes, sir, Bar.
there's a big difference in the categories. Some are actual fire, and lime is not fire. Lime is burning through the acidity or whatever.
I hear you, except that I'm reading the translation here, and it sounds like the lime is actually on fire. I may be wrong. Could lime catch fire?
Don't think so.
Well, then I stand corrected. Um,
The same thing with plaster or whatever the other category.
yeah,
was.
actually, we're using sidroi teyach. It sounds like it's not directly exposed to. All right, for the purpose of this text, let's assume all of these things are fired up. I know lime is generally understood to be it has a corrosive or dissolving effect. And I understand that that is not a result of heat, it's because of its corrosive nature. But
But
for the
it looks
purpose of
like
this,
the results looks like burns. That is, it is not fire, but the effect on the skin is similar to fire.
right. So generally speaking, again, I understand that we're describing here things that are likely corrosive elements that are not fired. But just to understand, just a peripheral reading of the text indicates that these items have also been heated up. I don't understand what the contribution may be to heat it up, but I suspect that lime, maybe to make it more molten, would heat possibly make it more molten, make it pour better for whatever purpose, or plaster. I don't know, but that's what it sounds like from here. But anyways, Rebero, you are correct. We're talking in this brisa about a variety of different hot stuff, to use and even including boiled water. So where's the question? So the question is as follows: Taima, the Rabbi Rachamana michva michva. Why are we very inclusive? Why do we say that for the purpose of tsaras, any heat burn is enough? It's because the Torah uses the word burn as opposed to describing or overemphasizing the source of the burn. But absent this doubled language, I would assume that fire and coal are really two separate items and they are not synonymous halachically. So this is an interesting type of question. Again, Rebbe says if you cook your carbon pesach on coal, it's kosher. That means roasted by fire. The challenge here is a brisa that indicates that only because of the Torah's very inclusive, expansive language to highlight the injury, not the source, for the purpose of tsaras, and therefore we are very inclusive. The only reason why we're inclusive is because of the language of the Torah when describing a burn. But otherwise, I would not automatically assume that to be burnt or cooked on coal would be the same as being cooked by fire. This is the Gemara's challenge to Rav Chisda. Let's see how Rav Chisda will answer this challenge. Amar lei, Rav Chisda's response was, there are coal that is so utterly synonymous with fire that the Torah doesn't need to include. But there are other types of coals that are less obvious, and it is the less obvious coal that's being included in the brisa of tsaras. But when Rebbe mentions coal, he's talking about the coals that are so utterly identical to fire that it doesn't need to be said. Namely, Amarlei, wooden coal, which is the end result of burning wood. Although you're right, when you look at it now, it looks like a coal, but that is part of the fire process. However, there are other types of coal or red hot things that are in Hebrew called gacheles. Gacheles has to do with the fact that it's what's the right word? It's molten or it's red. The gacheles shamataches, and apparently there was such a thing as a metal coal, which again you see Rabbi Steinsaltz doesn't translate coal because that in English coal is a specific type of thing, but in the Hebrew language gacheles is a little more inclusive, and so we're talking about red hot metal, which that would be a chiddush that the brisa needs to add. So just to recap and to simplify, if you have a charred piece of wood that's part of the fire process, that's considered fire. And that Rebbe didn't need to even note. The reason why the brisa makes a chiddush, Do you know that gachelas also is included? That's really, we're describing red hot metal. The difference is obvious. Beryl, when you want to make a fire, metal is not going to help your fire burn. You could heat up the metal, but it's not fuel. Whereas woods and other types of coal that are really effectively fuel that in the end maybe can retain much heat. And if you blow on it, fire still comes out, which means that on the inside there's some kind of fire-like dynamic. And that, Rebbe says comfortably, is considered roasting on fire. A fairly simple point, but because of the language gap, I think we could miss this point. Reb Beryl, you're going to add something here?
What's that?
No, I thought someone was going to say something. I missed who it was.
No.
Anyone?
Oh, I was saying that when it comes to the fire, where will we fit in electric heat, like in an oven or a stove?
So, Mark, I didn't hear. Your mic's coming a little distant, but if I understand what you're saying, you're making a very interesting point.
An electric heat, because it
What an electric range counts for the carbon Pesach. Can we cook the carbon Pesach on an electric source of heat?
Yeah.
What's your default? What's your assumption here based on what we just read?
I imagine that's the same thing as hot metal.
Oh, so maybe the Gemara actually was very.
Hot metal, or is it like a coal?
So, Mark, help us out. What would you say?
Is it more like a coal because it's glowing red, and it actually has? It's almost like fire.
But is there
Now,
fuel?
if you took a hot metal and put a match to it, would it light? Because if you take a electric heating element and you put a match to it, it'll ignite.
Interesting.
I guess it depends on the temperature. Yeah.
No, you're right that metal is hot. I'm sorry. You're right that a cooking range or heating range, talking about electric range, is hot enough to ignite a match or to light something on fire. But it presently has no fuel.
You have a modern problem, a microwave,
right?
which basically heats without any flame at all.
We have a friend from Israel. Rafe, is it?
Yes,
What would you say? Electric cooking. Would that be more like the coal of wood or the coal of metal?
don't know.
Let me ask you, in Netanya, do you cook with gas or with electric?
We cook with induction, actually.
Okay, you see, it's important we have to make sure Israel's cooking reality is well represented. Yasher koyach. Thank you. So, Mark, yeah, my gut says, again, without digging too deeply,
and the cooktops are gas, but in Israel,
my gut's telling me that cooking range, electric burner, maybe even a glass top, that would all probably be closer to the gachela shel mateches. It's not fuel that's burning; it's a heated metal or it's a heated range. Now, again, we can get it'll get a whole lot more complicated if we'll take it further, and we have engineers here, and I'm not one of them. But I'm sorry.
The old style. I mean, once you have a glass cooktop or induction or anything else, it's not quite the same. But when you have the old coil, you're
saying it's red hot.
Yeah, I mean that's a red hot, almost like a coal. Although it's depending on the electricity going. Well, that's I guess electricity is its fuel actually.
So, but let's call the electricity fire. But even so it's like
so
the
let me
metal
ask you a
that's.
question. So I have a question. Remember
Okay.
with the shapud, with the spit, if it was matecha, there was a question whether it's okay to use a metal spit.
Right.
So if it's okay, if it's considered a kachelet, then why would it be a problem?
Well, it's not. It's not. It hasn't been considered like. But that's a very good question, or it's a very good point. If we were somehow to go take the step further and say that gacheles shel eitz is acceptable, and actually gacheles shel mateches is acceptable, which again I think it is not, then we'd have an interesting question about cooking the carbon pesach on a metal spit. But even there, the metal spit is very, very hot, but it's not red hot because its two edges are on fire. But again, my understanding, and I'm fairly confident, we have thus far excluded the metal. And we're just saying that when Rebbe uses the word gacheles, he means the default. Gacheles means gacheles shel eitz. If it's gacheles shel mateches, you have to say it's gacheles shel mateches. You have to note that that's how I understand it. Okay, the Gemara is not done yet. The Gemara is now going to explore another instance where where you need to use fire, and we'll see. Let's take a look. This next Gemara is not for the faint-hearted, but let's do our best. Is it so that fired up metal, red hot metal, is not considered halachically fire? There is a painful pasuk and halacha in the Torah about a unique consequence for a bas koyin, a girl from a koyin family who engages in adultery, which is dichsiv Aish tisaref. Her penalty would be fire. Look at Rabbi Steinsaltz on the daughter of a priest. If she profanes herself through adultery, she profanes her father. In fire she shall be burnt.
And isn't that actually
Again,
molten lead, which is with of metal? It's molten
Yeah.
lead.
That's where we're heading.
Right.
So first, let's make all the caveats. Obviously, the death penalty, we're told in the Gemara, was very rare, and there had to be hasra and many conditions met. So it's not like this was a frequent event, but nonetheless, this is the consequence. And Mark, I think you're referencing what we're going to see in a moment, which is that the way they would do sreifa biblically, or not biblically, the way Jewish people would do in the temple times, sreifa was not burn at the stake. It was a burning of it was an internal burning. And those who read the Rambam, Mark,
It's supposed
Professor?
to be molten lead, I think.
Yeah. That's exactly what we're about to say.
Yeah.
Professor, you're going to say something?
No.
Okay.
I'm just surprised to hear that.
Yeah. Rav Masna explains how would they use the consequence of Aish, burning in fire. Psila shel avar hayo oisim. They would use molten lead. Molten lead, it would be swallowed. Matichoi v'zorkoi l'toich pia. They would soften it. They would fire it up, and then they would pour it into her mouth. Now, I do want to note they would heat it up, and they would pour it into the person who's getting sreifa, their mouth. So what do we see here, Mark? That molten metal is considered fire. So the Gemara says, no, this is unique. Shani Hassel. The Amar Kra, the verse describes Ba'esh, Tisarev. She is burnt with fire. L'rabbis kol sreifos habayis min ha'esh, to be inclusive of any manner of burning that is a byproduct of fire's heat. To include this manner. Now, assuming a person has no way to avoid a death penalty, would you say that this is a more humanitarian method, a kinder method, a more gruesome method? Again, if this is making you uncomfortable, close your ears and we'll move on in about 30 seconds. But if you had to choose
it's barbarian.
I'm sorry?
It's barbarian.
What, this manner?
Sure.
Do you think it's better or worse than being tied to the stake?
Both are terrible.
Right. I mean, God forbid, anything
I
that
think you would go a lot faster this way than being tied to the stake.
this may be a faster method, and also it leaves the body whole, which allows for responsible
Rabbi.
atonement. Yes.
And a more basic question, why does the phrase allow this kind of interpretation? She shall be burned, shall be burned. What's so special that we could learn from those 3 words that you could do all this kind of stuff?
Because we're emphasizing the activity versus the material. We're emphasizing what happens to the individual. Less, meaning we're looking at the outcome more than the...
Yeah, but where do we get it from the Hebrew phrase? They have to...
Tisarev. She shall be burnt in fire. Or by fire, let's translate it. And so the Chazal understand this to be more inclusive of any manner of being burnt by fire. Now, admittedly, there is a step, because there's the fire that melts the lead that is containing now the heat of the fire. But because the main focus is on the result, therefore, one would be allowed to use. Hold on, but the Gemara is not done yet. The Gemara is going to ask a question which may actually be reflecting your comment. If it says Aish tisaref, v'chol shekain Aish atzma, shouldn't we prefer and use fire itself instead of using molten lead? Why don't we surround her with wood and do an auto de fe type situation? So the Gemara says, actually, it's an interesting point, but we have an added input which informs us of how this burning should happen. We have another place in the Chumash, a description of someone that's burnt. Asya Sureifa Mibnei Aharon. We know the tragic events, which we're actually going to read about soon. Pikudei, right? Vayikra Tzav Shemini. So we're going to read soon about the tragic death of Aaron's sons. Their death was Sureifa. Malahalon Sureifas Neshama V'guf Kayam. And Chazal tell us, based on a careful reading of the Psukim, that they were burnt on the inside, but their bodies remained whole. Sureifas Neshama, they were killed by fire, but their body remained whole. Afkan Sureifas Neshama V'guf Kayam. Similar here, we're going to use this, or the end result will be similar to the death of Bnei Aaron. And Rashi right away flags for us, Sanhedrin, the Gemara in Sanhedrin describes, it was as if two strings of fire went up there through their nose and burned them on the inside. This was probably more of a spiritual death, but the result was the same. It's described that they were burnt, but ultimately their bodies remained whole. So the Gemara is not done yet. So let's use boiling here. 1 second. Use chami or use water. Use water, boiling water. Mishum de Rav Nachman Rav after Echak Moicha Bur Loi Misa Yafa. Choose a compassionate death. Now, sometimes there is no choice. Of course, you'll ask them, you'll say no death. Tragically, that's not always an option. But we can look for an option that is the most compassionate, all things considered. This is a very fascinating line in the Gemara. A line of the Gemara that gets a lot of attention by all different ethicists and other people, because one of the primary applications of love your fellow as yourself is ironically in a scenario where the end result is a death penalty execution. And so it's a little hard to it might be hard to wrap our mind around this. And yet it is so that even a person who's deserving of the worst consequences in the Jewish tradition, even they are deserving of compassion to the greatest extent possible. And so if we have a whole menu of options, certainly the molten lead would be more pleasant than boiling, which would be a much more barbaric and gruesome type of end for a person. Rashi,
You call that compassion?
again, there's no option to say none of the above. Obviously, the best thing would be none of the above. But when that's not an option, so then the best of the worst scenarios would be, as mentioned. You know, it's funny. I mean, I learned this Gemara before, so obviously I knew it, but I always wondered when I would learn the Rambam, where I'd see this referenced, I would wonder why they would use lead instead of, actually, I think the Rambam actually quotes this, but I wondered why would they do it in this manner? But we see the Gemara, and I guess that's what, obviously, the Rambam's work is based on presenting his final determination based on the Gemara's conversation. This is considered, all things considered, the most compassionate of options. Remember where we're really heading towards. Really, our question was cooking the Karban Pesach, coal versus fire. And we're trying to understand how purist, how particular we are about fire versus heat that is a byproduct of fire. And so far we've encountered Saras, which is a mikveh, which is a burn, but the language is inclusive and expansive, and therefore it doesn't have to be fire, it could even be a coal. We then introduce this very painful topic, the topic of someone who deserves a death penalty through fire, and we wonder why the Torah is inclusive of other forms of consequences beyond literal fire, and why we are comfortable with molten lead, which is effectively gacheles shel mateches. And we noted that the language of the Aish Soref describes a result of a person being burnt, and because of the added input of sreifa, the manner that Aaron's sons passed, and this should be as close as possible. Therefore, it's a manner that the fire is deployed to the internally, leaving the body whole. And being that of all the different options where this could be done, this is from the, let's call it, a more compassionate, rapid, and doesn't disgrace or debase the body of the individual. And
Rabbi,
yes.
I have a general problem, I guess. If we say that the death penalty was rarely, if ever, used, why do we go into such details? Because normally one would say all these details are there because of the frequency of them having to be applied. So doesn't that sort of clash with the fact that hardly ever did anybody get put to death?
In the Gemara's language, who moisiv la v'hu mifarik? What's lashon? Who moisiv la v'hu? Anyways, your question comes with the answer, which is that first of all, our Gemara is unafraid to spend a lot of ink to probe even a quite infrequent event. The Gemara is committed to getting the tradition correct and accurate, and is unafraid of a rare scenario. We've seen this many times before, but particularly because this process, this exploration, has implications for a number of other topics, and so the Gemara is quite comfortable spilling ink and allowing us to spin our wheels thinking about this, even if it is a very rare occasion. Now, the same Gemara that says that the death penalty was exceedingly rare says that nonetheless, if it was warranted, it was carried out. The Torah does not espouse a belief system that is anti the death sentence. They just want it to be rare and very, very in a very, very high standard to make sure that it's not done when not warranted. But anyways, that would be my fastest understanding.
The bottom line is it's hard to appeal.
Yeah, I mean, this is a hard Gemara. This is not anyways. But this is one of those ironic places where v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is used even to a person who you might be inclined to dehumanize. The person is going to be put to death. You're judging them as having done a sin that's very, very not acceptable. And yet, at the same time that the Torah says this is the consequence, and the Sanhedrin carries out the consequence, we still yet must maintain the Avas Yisrael and give the person as much dignity as possible under the circumstances. And again, it's a complicated idea to wrap our head around, but I think it's important to note that as well. Okay. Now that we have Rav Nachman's comment, which is v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, bror lo misa yafa, Gzeira Shava Lamali. Why do we need the Gzeira Shava? Remember, there was two notes. Rav Nachman says, give the most compassionate form of Sreifa. We had a Gzeira Shava that says Sreifa, that it should be akin to the death of Aaron's sons. Hello? Gzeira Shava mibnei Aaron Lamali. Why do we have to use the end of Aaron's sons? We need to do a compassionate type of execution. So the Gemara says, absent the Gzeira Shava of Sreifa, Hava. I mean, I would think Sreifa is Neshama V'uv Kaim of Sreifa, a type of subjecting the person to heat in a manner that does not damage the body might not be considered sreifa. So therefore, we need the story of Aaron to remind us that the Torah does describe such an end as sreifa. But if we would only have Rav Nachman, we would say Neifush la chavilei zemaris tuva. Bring a lot of fuel. Ki hechi the tamos ba'agala, so that the person's end would be very rapid, very speedy. Kamash Malan. Therefore, we also understand the teaching about Aaron's sons that this is actually preferred. Rashi. Without this limud, I would think that fire means fire. And it would have to be with a lot of fuel. I would suppose that burning internally is not considered fire. They'll make a very big fire, and then the person will pass rapidly. Therefore, now we know that the manner of burning internally is an option. Now we know this is the most ideal of an unideal circumstance.
Rabbi, I'm sorry, but in the real world, who's to say that this is a better death? Who knows what it's like to swallow molten lead or whatever?
So unfortunately, no one has come back to tell. But I suppose by observation, people who lived in a time where this was more familiar understood that this was, of all options, considered more compassionate. I'd rather not spend too much time pondering the intricacies of the matter, but I suppose if we would try to think about it deeply, we could understand and maybe come to a similar conclusion. So the Gemara says, okay, now that we've established that we are very, very, to quote a great sage, loosey-goosey, with extra credit if you know which sage I'm quoting. Now that we are being quite flexible to include many different types of sreifa, burning, not only directly exposed to fire, but Aish lamali, what is the word Aish can even add here? What does it teach us? So the Gemara says, La'afuke avor me'ikaroi, to exclude naturally molten lead that is not heated up by fire. As Rashi says, Avar me'ikara, shemaitzi and oisim in akakar teach hu buloi told us Aish. Again, I don't know if this exists today, but it seems like there was the ability to extract molten lead. Again, I don't know where I would find molten lead from the earth, but the point is that would not be acceptable. It has to actually be heated up by real, live fire. And this, my dear friends, concludes this little exploration on the definition of fire and for comparing Sli Aish, roasted by fire, versus other places in halacha, other places in the Torah, where firing is necessary or fire is necessary, and understanding why in those other cases, based on both the language and the limudim, there was more flexibility, whereas when it comes to Tzli Aish, we're a whole lot more narrow in our definition of Tzli Aish. The Gemara is going to take us onto one more tangent, and I believe this tangent is reflective somewhat of Rebel's question, so let's take a look. Let's try our best. So again, we finished the initial comparison. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the description of Be'esh Tisaref, describing the scenario where a person needs to have a consequence of, or an execution with fire. Rav Yirmiyah asks Rav Zera, or says to Rav Zera, anytime the Torah describes that a person should be burnt by fire, the rabbis call sreifos, abois, machmas, eshu, is this to be inclusive of all different types of heat? that is sourced or originally created by fire. Viha, can be parim hanisrafim. We have a situation in the Torah of a parim hanisrafim, bulls that are to be burnt. A par that's a chatos. The Torah says, it shall be burnt al eitzim ba'esh, on wood with fire, v'tanya ba'esh, and the Brisa reads this pasuk and clarifies, fire, v'loy b'sidrei teach, you can't use boiling lime, v'loy b'giv sidrei teach, and not this other molten type of lime. And so we have an instance which also describes burning. But here we are very, very specific. It should dafka be real, live fire. So how can you tell me that whenever you use the word be'esh tisarif, it's meant to be inclusive? Amarle says, Hachi hashna. What kind of question are you asking? Hasam ksiv be'esh, v'hadar tisarif. Here, the chronology of the words, it first says fire, and then it says tisarif, you should be burned. Going from a more narrow manner to a more expansive manner. Aish is one, burning is by many. And so the chronology or the trajectory of the pasuk is to expand or to broaden our options. Here it is the reverse. Shall be burnt, and then we make it more and more specific. So this is a very interesting insight into one of the manners of how a pasuk is potentially deciphered or interpreted in a manner where, did we turn the page yet, or about to turn the page? We're about to turn the page.
So Rabbi, this is
because we're still in the middle of a debate. So let's see if this ends up holding out. But at this point, yes. Depending on the direction of the pasuk, we look at the ensuing words as commentary, clarification, and potentially tightening up our definition. So if we say ba'esh tisaref, we start with a more narrow definition, and then tisaref shall be burnt. We open it for more options, or it's more of a creative or broad group of items at our disposal. Whereas by the parachata, by the parim hanisrafim, the Torah first starts, they'll be burnt, and then it says very specifically how the burning should happen. Rebel, hold your question just for another second, and then we're going to ask you to bring it back. The Gemara says, 1 second. Hasam nami ksiva sheifa lebasayif. But if you read it very carefully, we actually also have the language of burning at the end, because the verse continues and says, Al shefech hadesh and yisaref. The ash is burnt. Amri ahu yisaref mivoyle the tanya yisaref avol pi shein sham deshen yisaref avol pi shehitzi sa'or berubay. So we're going to read Rabbi Steinsaltz in a moment. But before we even see the specific limud, to understand that over here, the yisaref was not even talking about the burning of the parim hanisrafim per se. It's coming to tell us a different halacha. But in theory, yes, had it been a single sentence that ended with a more expansive language, we maybe would be more, we maybe would give us more options. Let's read Rabbi Steinsaltz, then we'll look at Rashi, and then we'll round things up, or we'll cap this up. So the Torah says, when the ash is poured, it shall be burnt. So we say that we need it, it shall be burnt, even though there's no ash. Sometimes there would be no ash there, you should still burn it. And it shall be burnt, even though it was mostly already burnt. And so we're taking ash and reburning it, even if there's no other ash. And so this extra pasuk is coming to teach us something very different than the original discussion, which is that it needs to be burnt. Let's open the pasuk so we can visualize it in its source. This might be helpful. Oh, what just happened? The entire bull is taken out of the camp. Al Makim Tahar, where the ashes are poured out. The saraf oisain, you shall burn it al eitzim ha'esh, over wood, fire. You see, general, more and more specific. And then the pasuk adds al shefa chadesh and yisarif, it shall be burnt over there in the place where the ashes poured out. So in the havamin, in the question, we say even though it ends the prescription or the description here by noting once again that it should be burnt, it seems to reopen the issue to have more options, more manners of burning, more types of burning. Until the Gemara explains, no, actually, this line is teaching us one halacha, which is how it should be burnt. And this line is teaching us that even if we're missing ash, the place has no old ash, or if what you have already has been utterly burnt, you still would burn it again. So it's a different limud than the limud of the manner of burning.
It's interesting, they say wood fire, so how would that go? Today we have all kinds of, we have natural gas fire, et cetera, or propane.
So those, we would likely apply the same principle. If we have an expansive idea of burning, then maybe we would include it. If we have a more narrow...
Then what if it was
But Mark, you realize there's a big difference between all the types of burning we've mentioned here and a lot of the modern methods of burning, which is namely a lot of the burning, and the Gemara has a term for it too. The burning that we're talking about here all originate with fire, the heat of fire.
Right.
And so it's still it's still related to Aish. I'm sorry?
They could have had an oil fire,
An oil fire is with fire.
As opposed to a fire but with
We're
wood.
less curious by the fuel unless there is no fire and it's just the remaining residual thing that's holding on to the heat. By the way, avar me'ikara that we said before, right? The lead from its source, that would be an example of apparently, let's call it lava, right? Lava or science molten that emerges from the core, from the surface of the earth, which is incredibly hot. But that's not considered fire. And
like
so that would get its whole own set of questions. Then there's the question, not here, but elsewhere, we talked about cooking on Shabbos, and you have Chamei Tiveria, right? Which is naturally occurring hot waters. And there's a whole discussion. Do we consider this? Right? All right, I think we're going to pause over here. My dear friends, in short, today was an interesting detour. The primary objective is to talk about cooking the Karban Pesach and understanding the manner that a Karban Pesach can and cannot be cooked. We have the question of, can you use coal? We have Rebbe saying, yes, you can. We have other instances where apparently the word gacheles is not acceptable. And we clarified that there's wood, coal, which is really the end result of burning this fuel. And then you have molten metal or heated metal, which is not a fuel, it's just heated up. We use that to possibly distinguish between a cooking range versus fire or gas cooking, let's call it. And then we went on a survey of other instances in the Gemara or in Halacha where fire is used. And for some reason, we were more open-minded. We were more expansive on the manners, the ways that we would burn. And in each case, we analyzed and clarified based on a reading of the Psukim why there we were comfortable being more expansive. So we talked about Saras, then we talked about the Bas Koyin, who has to be burnt. And we had a little insight into the process of which of execution, not the easiest or not the easiest Gemara to study. But anyways, that is the gist of today's exploration. My dear friends, I failed to make our dedication in the beginning, so we'll do it now. Of course, our learning is l'schos the members of our chabura and their households for health and happiness and only good news. I do want to mention Yisrael Moshe ben Shmuel, Yisrael Moshe ben Yisrael Moshe ben Shmuel Halevi. His neshama shaven aliyah. We should have good news for Klal Yisrael, and especially we should have good news from Israel for the Chayalim. We should have good news for those that need to come home, and everyone that needs healing should find that healing. B'karav mamash refuat nefesh refuat leguf, and let this month of Elul be this month of Adar Beis be a month that truly brings simcha, and we should have a repeat of the story of Purim, of a complete triumph for Klal Yisrael, and we should once again be able to say without any pshetlach, La Yehudim Hoysa Oira V'Simcha V'Sasam V'Yikar, and along with it, of course, would be healing for the members of our Chabura, no boo-boos, no pain, and only good news for all. Thank you so much for being along for the ride. Have a wonderful day and hope to see everyone tomorrow. Be'ezer Hashem, in greater health and with greater circumstances. Shkayach.
Good, thanks.